joining us for the first time, the Jacqui webinar series serves as a platform for the Jacqui network members to share experience and expertise in evidence syntheses and to learn about potential collaborations. Before we start, in case you're using GoToWebinar for the first time, if you have any questions, please use the raise your hand button to be unmuted, or submit your questions using the toolbar on the right. GoToWebinar automatically mutes all attendees unless we help you let us know what you're thinking of or what your question is. So the session today will take around 20 to 30 minutes, and we'll be taking questions at the end. Thank you. Today's session is part of our webinar series on stakeholder engagement in evidence syntheses. And the session is specifically on Much at Stake, the importance of training and capacity building for stakeholder engagement in evidence syntheses. Our presenter is Dr. Jacqui Eales. Thank you for joining us today, Jacqui. So Jacqui has worked in evidence syntheses since 2009. She set up some of the first trainings delivered by the CEE, the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, at its first center in the UK in 2010, and has since delivered training in Europe, the Americas, and Asia as a CEE trainer. As well as being based at UK universities, Jacqui has worked as an independent consultant in evidence syntheses for the York Health Economics Consortium and for the Stockholm Environment Institute. She is now based at the University of Exeter, working on evidence syntheses and exploring the trade-offs and synergies around the environment and human health nexus. Let me add that Jacqui is also assessing how we can involve other centers in low-income countries who are experienced in environmental issues to start taking on systematic reviews and connecting with us to build capacity. So Jacqui, thank you for joining us today. Let me share your screen. And hello?
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you now. Hi, Jacqui.
Hi, Tamara. So, shall I get going?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Okay, so welcome everybody. It's great to be here virtually with you. And today, as Tamara said, I'm going to be focusing on this issue around training and capacity building and how that relates to how we engage stakeholders in our evidence syntheses. So this presentation is based around a paper which was published in Environmental Evidence in 2017, which I wrote with a couple of co-workers of mine. And I just wanted to present the findings of that paper which we wrote together, and share some of the thoughts that we had around how we can engage more with our stakeholders and how we can use training and capacity building as an opportunity for stakeholder engagement in many parts throughout this evidence synthesis process. So I wanted to give a brief introduction to myself, but Tamara has wonderfully captured all of the things that I wanted to say. So yes, I've been working in evidence syntheses since, well, 2010. Starting off at the Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation based at the University of Wales in Bangor, and then have since worked as an independent consultant for many organisations, including YHEC, Mistra EVM based in Sweden, which is one of the other centre collaboration for environmental evidence centres, and also they're based at the Stockholm Environment Institute as well. Currently, I'm at the University of Exeter, based in a centre called the European Centre for Environment and Human Health, and that's where that nexus part comes in. I'm working on a research programme called Blue Communities, which is a UK Research Institute funded GCRF programme, and we are looking at building capacity for sustainable marine environments in Southeast Asia, and that's where my interest in lower middle income countries come in, because we're working with a number of partners out there. We're looking towards the Sustainable Development Goals of no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being and life below water. But as you know, probably know, with the SDGs, these goals link into many of the other global goals too. Just one final thing before we move on to the actual presentation. As I wanted to mention, I also work for two NGOs. One of them is called Earthwatch Institute, based in the UK, and one of them is known as Operation Wallacea. These NGOs are environmentally focused, and we look at building capacity for knowledge around sustainability and the retention of our biodiversity. And if you're interested in those, I'm sure you can look those up to see what other work we do. I work as an environmental educator and facilitator, as well as a research PI. And that's where I keep my hand into my environmental research. So that's a little bit about me. A little bit about this paper then, and I wanted to say really that I'm going to be focusing rather a little bit on the environmental side of things, because that's the background that I have. I understand that many of the attendees will not necessarily be from an environmental background, but I hope this gives you a good insight into how we're thinking in our discipline, and how also that translates across disciplines to the health and the social sciences that evidence synthesis has been used in. And here's just a screenshot of the paper which we wrote together. It was published in 2017. So what am I going to be talking about over the next 20 minutes or so? We'll be talking about the training gap which we identified in the paper. I'll also run through a definition of what we mean by stakeholders. I'll then talk about how we want to involve stakeholders in capacity training and capacity building, a few of the challenges and opportunities, and then spend some of the time talking about 5 different pathways to stakeholder engagement in training and capacity building, and very much see training and capacity building and stakeholder engagement as a two-way sort of information flow. Hopefully that will come out during the presentation. So the training gap then. We know that particularly in the environmental sciences, we've been working towards upskilling people in how to undertake systematic reviews and maps. This is because it's a relatively rare skill set, and training is necessary to increase the generally low uptake of systematic methods in the field of environmental science and management. I believe this is somewhere which the other disciplines were 10, 20, 30 years ago, when evidence syntheses were starting to come about in those fields. So I think we see the environmental field as just being the next generation moving through to trying to upskill our researchers and the whole community in what evidence syntheses look like and what their benefits are. So the aim here is to really increase the adoption of systematic methods, but we also recognise that there's a lack of learning from the training experience that we've gone through in other disciplines. So although in the health sciences, for example, there's been much work around training, there's online courses, plenty of training providers, there hasn't been much crosstalk across disciplines where we can learn from experience in training in general, but also stakeholder engagement in training across those disciplines. Before we delve any further, I just wanted to give you this, this slide to kind of define where we are with our stakeholder definition. We're seeing it as very much an inclusive definition, and this is something which we mentioned in the paper, and is also I think mentioned in some other papers in the series around stakeholder engagement in environmental evidence. So we see stakeholders as being anybody who has an interest in the conduct or the outputs of an evidence synthesis. And that actually includes the review authors themselves, topic researchers, those people who will be using the results or the outcomes of reviews, decision makers, indeed anybody who is affected by or involved within the review or map. So that's where we sit with our definition of stakeholders. And then when you think about that in relation to training and capacity building, you can see how important stakeholder engagement is across all of those different sectors. So, as well as there being a training gap, I wanted to identify here that there's also a lack of focus of stakeholders when it comes to training and capacity building. And this, I would say, would be seen across the disciplines and across the networks, so across Cochrane, Campbell, and also CEE, the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. Generally, to date, we see that training is recognised mainly as a capacity building importance for reviewers, those conducting the review. And indeed, the collaboration's guidance generally focuses on the conduct of undertaking a specific review or MAP project. But rather than this, we see that actually there's some benefit to including systematic reviews, training and capacity building with stakeholders in systematic reviews throughout the process. And we see this as there's a need for continual awareness raising around this. Indeed, a strategic approach would lead to an increased uptake of systematic reviews and maps as methods, and that's something, as I mentioned earlier, is quite important to us in the environmental sector. So what, if we think that's currently not enough stakeholder engagement in training and capacity building, and it's currently undervalued, what do we think are the benefits of it? Well, we know that training and capacity building increases the direct and indirect communication, particularly between these different stakeholder groups, which we feel is really important. And having that two-way information flow, which would come from this effective communication, can ensure that our evidence syntheses really do concentrate on the issues of most importance, so that they can be understood, or the outputs of reviews can be understood by a wider audience. And also the benefits of the evidence-based approach can be truly seen. Those benefits of transparency, accuracy, accountability, and also the minimising of duplication of research efforts. So that's identifying where there are research gaps and showing where more research should be filled. I wanted to identify now some of the key challenges we see in evidence synthesis training. This isn't necessarily confined to stakeholder engagement, but apply to all sorts of training. So these are 10 of the challenges we identified within our paper, so I'd just like to bring those up now. So firstly, explaining key or complex concepts in lay terms is one of the challenges we commonly face. Deciding between whether to deliver overview training or methods training, so an overview or very detailed methods and what's appropriate. Challenges in explaining the relatively abstract concepts without information overload, and so this includes those steps, for example, critical appraisal and meta-analysis. Determining when systematic review or MAP methods are appropriate. So looking at how resources, timeline, staffing, and the desired output of your evidence synthesis feed into making that decision. Ensuring that the participants of training appreciate that while the robust evidence syntheses require greater resources than the traditional reviews, the payoff really is in the reliability of the results. The need for ongoing training as our methods develop and improve. This is something which we see with some of the more developed networks and collaborations such as Cochrane, but it's something which we're increasingly recognising as the environmental sector methods improve and develop. Something I didn't actually mention at the top of this presentation is that I'm a member of the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence's training team and have been pretty much since that team began, and we're seeing this as an increasing challenge. Making training cost efficient is always something that needs to be considered and can be often challenging. Tailoring the training media to the situation, so whether to deliver via workshops, written media, or any other of the mechanisms which I'll mention later. Providing continued support for people who are conducting reviews, so that's could be mentorship, it could be provision of further training. and ensuring an appreciation of the importance of course accreditation by coordinating bodies. So this is something which the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence has been working on, and we have accreditation for both our trainers who are endorsed and our courses who can also be endorsed as well. And appreciating the importance of that is quite a focus for us at the moment. So those are 10 of the key challenges, and they will link into some of the things I'll be talking about later. So what are the opportunities then to improve stakeholder engagement through training? This is something that we've identified, and I want to run through the 5 broad categories where we can see this as taking place. So I've got 5 slides coming up to describe and explain those 5 broad categories. So the first one here is end user and public engagement. And here we see that the stakeholders really that we're targeting with this kind of training would be the reviewers. And these reviewers, and the purpose of the training would be to provide the skills to systematic reviewers which relate to stakeholder analysis, conflict management, and participatory methods. So why is this important? Well, we know that particularly reviewers who are new to methods of evidence synthesis often lack sufficient skills to engage effectively with stakeholders. And particularly the nuances involved with stakeholder engagement for evidence synthesis might not be apparent. This links into some of our challenges as well. So, for example, explaining the review methods in sufficient but not too much detail, again linking into one of our challenges just described, and predicting and managing some of the conflicts which might arise between different stakeholder groups, as well as maintaining an interest and enthusiasm for the method throughout the process of the review, which can sometimes take months and even running into years. We know that engaging with stakeholders can be a complex and challenging process. It can require careful planning, and there's the possibility of bias creeping into reviews or undue influence from particular stakeholder groups. Managing this, facilitating this, organising stakeholder engagement workshops and events can take a significant amount of time and cost. And this is something which needs to be planned into the review and also recognised from the very beginning of the review so that the timelines are appropriate to the engagement of stakeholders at this process. Usually this kind of engagement or training would come at the beginning of the process, so around the scoping and question formulation. And we would suggest that the training media would be either in person or potentially online. We would recommend this to be in person because it fits in with the modality of stakeholder engagement which the reviewers would be undertaking as well, because generally those kinds of engagements would be by video call or Skype call, or typically in the stakeholder engagement forum. So that's the first of our broad categories. The second category of training is that training which involves the technical aspects of systematic review and MAP methods. So which stakeholders would be involved here? Well, this will typically be those undertaking the reviews. So we're talking about reviewers, and these might be students or early career researchers. So the purpose of this training is to provide that technical knowledge, that in-depth methodological training, which many of us are familiar with in terms of training materials. This is the typical capacity building training which is generally offered. So looking through the steps of the review process, looking at all of those different stages of evidence syntheses. And it can be anything from a basic one-day look at the methods to a full-blown methodology course, which can last several days. These are the kinds of courses which act as a primer for those people who are wanting to conduct syntheses. and are good for the planning stages of a systematic review. So this is where this would particularly come in useful. It may be that some students don't actually have a review that they're undertaking, and so this might actually slip in at any point during the systematic review kind of process. It could be at the beginning of a review, or even before a review has been thought of. And in terms of how we would undertake this kind of training, we would do it either in person, or it could be online via presentations or training courses. And those methods have been explored and very well developed in some of the other collaborations. And indeed, we're working towards those with the collaboration for environmental evidence. So the third broad category of stakeholder engagement in training, which we're suggesting, is in terms of how to prepare communication media for a review. Again, in terms of which stakeholders are involved here, it would generally be those who are involved with the review, so those involved with the conduct of the review. And the purpose of this is to produce a good range and an appropriate range of data visualizations and communication modalities, which could and may well be tailored for specific stakeholder groups, and also training in communication skills. I guess one thing to note here is that this training might be tailored specifically for systematic review outputs, or it could be a generalized communication and data visualization training. So with the former, that which is tailored to systematic reviews and maps, there are a number of softwares out there which can help us visualize that kind of data. One of which being meta-analysis data visualization software, the use of R to produce visualizations, other software packages and meta-analysis packages to produce visualizations, and also some of the recently developed mapping softwares or evidence atlas softwares. One which has recently been produced by a group called the ES, or Evidence Syntheses Tech Group, is called Evi Atlas. It's a freely available software on GitHub, and it allows you to be able to use geographical positioning if you have a latitude and longitude of study locations to be able to plot that onto an atlas or map. And it also uses pop-up data so that you can click on the map. It's an interactive process, and you can link to the paper itself or key information or metadata coded around those studies. This relates to the map which you can see at the bottom of the screen here. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor. I'm just moving it over this map with the different points on. That's for Southeast Asia. And I've also put here a heat map. So that's a matrix, oops, I've just clicked on. A matrix between the intervention and outcomes of various studies which we included in that systematic map. And that's another output from a software. So other types of training which are more generalized can help in producing communication tools such as information videos, and there's one shown up there at the top, which is a YouTube video produced by the Stockholm Environment Institute around one of their systematic reviews which they did. But also some infographics can be useful, and there are a number of online courses which can help as well. But also the production of fact sheets, technical summaries, and policy briefs, and it might be useful for reviewers to undergo training to produce appropriate policy briefs and fact sheets for their audiences. And the whole goal of this is really to ensure that the outputs of evidence syntheses are disseminated widely, understood and used by those target audiences. So increasing and improving the impact of our reviews. The value of evidence synthesis methods is another topic on which we suggest that stakeholder engagement should be embedded within the training and capacity building process. And the training that involves this is around the advocacy of systematic review and map methods. In terms of who would be engaged in this, it'd pretty much be all stakeholders, so those that are undertaking the review, those that have an interest in the review, those end users. So anyone who is involved in the review should be well versed in the value of the methods. So the need for methods and the methods involved in the maps and reviews, the requirement for the detailed methods which are involved, and training on how to interpret review findings, because that's something which many stakeholders and end users can struggle with. So essentially a basic understanding of how the benefits of systematic methods are compared to a traditional, informal, ad hoc or narrative literature review in terms of those central tenets: comprehensiveness, transparency, and objectivity. We also find that there's a need to be clear about the misunderstandings about what's required to make a review reliable, what's required and the amount of time that's taken and the amount of resources that is taken. And this training around the value of these synthesis methods can feed into recognising our stakeholders and commissioners, recognising how much is required to put into a review to get the right result out of it. So this kind of training can be at any stage of the review process, but it can fit very nicely at the very beginning stages around question formulation, also around the peer review, and even at the very end when we're communicating our outcomes. It's useful to be able to engage with our stakeholders around this. There's lots of different ways in which this media can be provided, but a written summary of this is often a useful way of communicating, because sometimes the stakeholders and end users don't necessarily have a huge amount of time or are unable to attend these kinds of trainings in person. The final category of training which we think is really important to engage our stakeholders in is around the technical critique of review methods. And for this, the stakeholders really sits strongly within the researcher community. We've found that there's, particularly in the environmental sciences, as I mentioned before, a misunderstanding around what it is to be a systematic review. We find more and more, as the word systematic gets used by us as reviewers, it's actually being increasingly used by people who don't understand what it is, and we're finding publication of syntheses calling themselves systematic reviews, but they actually even fail to meet even the basic qualifying standards of what we consider to be systematic reviews, and that's based on all of our definitions. So training of the research community in how to critically appraise can help our stakeholders to highlight common problems with these non-systematic reviews. To date, there's not been a huge amount of research in how to do this for a wide range of review types. We know that there are tools that are set up to appraise systematic reviews in general, such as appraise and recognise the reporting standards. So, for example, the PRISMA reporting standards for systematic reviews, and also the ROSES systematic reporting tool for environmental systematic reviews. But there's not been much work done to date on how to appraise non-systematic reviews. A team of researchers based in the environmental sciences attempted to address this for a number of years. And this has resulted in a workshop and a tool that came out of that workshop, which is called CSAT, that's C-E-E-S-A-T. It's the CEE systematic assessment tool, or synthesis assessment tool, and it's designed to be inclusive towards all types of reviews that are reviewing evidence, and assess the limitations and susceptibility to bias of these wide range of review methods, not just systematic reviews. for example, the presence of selection bias and the potential or the existence of vote counting within a review. So hopefully with this kind of training in technical critique of review methods, our researcher communities would be able to raise awareness within the research community about misunderstanding systematic methods, and also be able to justify the higher resource, often higher resource requirement of systematic reviews and maps. It also helps feed into that challenge of appreciating the value of endorsing reviews with a coordinating research, coordinating bodies such as Cochrane, Campbell and the CEE. So, having identified those 5 mechanisms or routes at which we could really engage stakeholders better in training capacity building for the benefit of using the research outputs from our systematic reviews more, just to summarise, we recognise that our systematic methods are a complex and nuanced suite of methods. They do require training. Stakeholder engagement is vital and should be integrated, as it hasn't been currently enough in all of the 3 disciplines that we concentrate on. We recognise that there's opportunities to train and capacity build at all occasions of engagement with stakeholders to increase awareness, acceptance and understanding the benefits of the systematic approach. So where do we go from here? Knowing the challenges of training, knowing some of the ways in which we could address the training gap and the training gap of stakeholder engagement in training capacity building, we really feel that this is an opportunity for collaborating across the network, so across the different collaborative networks. We can share the skills and experience for collective understandings, and really at this point in time, with particularly environmental sciences, with an increasing number of so-called systematic reviews, systematic syntheses, we see this as a great time to consolidate and optimise our efforts in trying to engage our stakeholders, all types of stakeholders, be they review authors, be they end users, be they commissioners, in the review process and in the training capacity building that goes alongside that process. I'd just like to end by saying thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to take questions at this point and also to receive any feedback by email if you would like to get in contact.
Thank you so much, Jacqui. This has been very interesting, and you know, there's a lot behind all these categories, and I'm sure you've been through a lot of back and forth until you were able to learn all these details. Before we start taking questions, I would actually ask you what you think the most challenging factor has been with your experience in training and capacity building for stakeholder engagement.
I would probably say that one thing I would like to say is about the range of stakeholders in which we engage in systematic reviews. So attempting to bring on that large range of stakeholders can be quite challenging in our reviews, and many of you who've undertaken reviews would probably agree with that. Part of the reason for that challenge is because of a lack of understanding or an apprehension that there might be a lot of time involved in engaging with reviews. So I see that as one of the main challenges, and ways in which we can address that is really about one of the broad categories which we identified, which is about promoting the value of systematic approaches across the board, and the way we do that I think importantly via different communication media. So attempting to bring that message about the systematic approach to our stakeholders, and that should help to increase engagement in our individual reviews.
Okay. It's very interesting to hear. So I think we'll open room now for questions from our colleagues in the audience. Or if anyone here, I see some names who have some experience with stakeholder engagement themselves. Please feel free to tell us about your experience and whether you relate to the importance of training capacity building, similarly to what Jacqui has explained earlier on. We'd be happy to hear about your experience too. So Jacqui, actually, maybe you can show us again the list of all the categories.
So I don't have a list of all of the categories, the 5 broad categories. I do have a list of the challenges in training.
Yeah, okay, we can do that.
Just scrolling back, and as we go through, I'm just scrolling back through those 5 broad categories. So they were technical critique of review methods, the value of evidence synthesis methods, preparation of communication media, systematic review and map methods, end user and public engagement. And this is the slide with the challenges of the training. So those are the 10 challenges which we identified within our paper.
And I think most of them actually apply to many fields, and they're not really just specific to the environmental field, right?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say so. For example, making training cost efficient is something which we are faced with all the time as trainers, and finding the correct price point to enable it to be an inclusive training is something which we struggle with constantly. Ways in which we try to get around this is by opening our training to more people if we have some spaces coming up on our trainings, to reduce travel costs by running several trainings within the same trip, and that also goes towards helping to minimize our carbon footprint, which is very important to us. And I would say, so we try and be inclusive towards our lower middle income country counterparts who want to attend this kind of training. There are other ways of doing this, of course, so making online courses available, whilst being able, the challenge is whilst being able to cover the costs of the production of that training.
Okay.
I would also,
sorry,
go on.
No,
Yes, so I would also point out on point 3, explaining relatively abstract concepts without information overload is another challenge which we're constantly faced with. And sometimes this can be challenging in terms of providing the right level of example exercises, which we do when we're doing the second type of training. So that's the systematic review and maps training. So that's where we really tend to go quite in depth. So that can be challenging in terms of the in-depth training, providing the right kind of examples, which are relatively discipline specific, but not too detailed. But when it comes to trying to explain those relatively abstract concepts to potential review commissioners or end users in a half-day workshop, which is about explaining the value of systematic methods, that can be really quite a challenge. So I think this is where the sharing experience can be really useful across the different disciplines, which is, I think, my final point on the presentation.
Okay. So I see that we have, I think our audience has felt that the presentation was very clear. But I'm sure that if anyone has any questions or any input, they can directly contact you and ask you for any more information. What I was actually going to ask
was about the resistance that some stakeholders might showcase. So was there a case where you felt some stakeholders would be very resistant to the concept of evidence syntheses?
Yeah, we often get this. So let me try and think of examples. So one example is where stakeholders have been keen and impatient to get on with what they think is the right way forward. So you might have a stakeholder who thinks they know the answer to the review question before the review's been undertaken. I don't know if others have experience of that, but I certainly do. That can be quite challenging because, again, it's a case of explaining the value of the systematic method and why the most obvious answer might not actually be the correct answer to the review question. So I would say that's probably one of the important ones that I've come across. And then resistance by some stakeholders, such as commissioners, to the costs and the time involved in doing a review. So again, this is around appreciating the true value of the systematic method. I would say ways in which we can combat that are having examples of where commonly held assumptions have been overturned, challenged, or the nuances have been shown through doing systematic methods. And I think that's a really good way of demonstrating to stakeholders the value of these kinds of methodologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, so Jacqui, again, thank you so much for joining us and for giving this great presentation. And obviously, you've had a lot of experience, and you know, I was personally very happy to learn all these details from you. We invite our attendees to contact Jacqui, either through us or we can share with you Jacqui's email. Feel free to send her your comments, or if there's any potential space for training or anything similar, feel free to also let us know, or Jacqui directly. The recording of this webinar will be available within 15 days. And make sure to join us on our next sessions. And thanks again, Jacqui.